Play ball! That's right, it's almost time for the World Series. And here we are at .NET Rocks. We're rooting for the Red Sox. Well, half of us are anyway. The other half was probably rooting for the Atlanta Braves. Of course, they missed it. But this isn't a show about baseball. It's about .NET. And it rocks, come to think of it. I am your host in New London, Connecticut, Carl Franklin. And as always, as is usually the case, I should say, my co-host, my partner in crime, Mr. Mark Dunn. How are you, Mark?
Howdy, Carl. How's it going?
I'm just caught up in the whole playoffs World Series thing and been, I'm a Red Sox fan, right?
I know that. I'm a Braves fan.
Well, we just got done watching the Red Sox clinch the first stage of the championship they're now playing the Yankees. They were playing the Oakland A's in a series of 5. And we all get all worked up about this in the Northeast, especially because we're so used to having our hopes dashed against the rocks at the last minute. Bill Buckner. Anyhow, we're not here to talk about baseball. We're here to talk about .NET. So how you been?
Hey, I've been doing good. I've recovered from our tavern show now.
Geez, I hope the world is recovered. Just judging by some of the response we got. Microsoft, as you know, is going to sponsor a .NET Rocks show at the PDC, the Primary Developers Conference. And it's going to be a Hollywood Squares type show with lots of experts and regional directors on a panel. It's going to be a lot of fun on Sunday night at the PDC, just so you know. But they gave that show to us under one condition, that we never, ever do another show from the Dutch Tavern. So
Right. I think that's best for everyone concerned.
Yeah, I saw a couple of blog entries. Carl and Mark get wasted. That was fun.
Well, we didn't go that far, but
No, a couple of beers.
Yeah.
Anyway, in response to that catastrophe, we are back with a stellar show. As you know, we've interviewed some incredible people on this show: Alan Cooper, Mark Anders, heavyweights like Billy Hollis and Rocky Lotka and Javal Lowy, Brent Rector, and the tradition continues today. We have, as you know, Mark, our guest, Scott Guthrie. When we were talking to him about how we should introduce him, we were trying to think of this long list of credentials, and there's really only one credential. He's in charge of the ASP.NET team at Microsoft.
Right.
And he is the guy who runs that team. He invented ASP.NET with Mark Anders. And he also runs the Visual Studio Web Development Tools team. So as he says, when you think of web development tools in .NET, you think of him. He's the guy who's in charge of it all.
No kidding, man. That's better than a degree from MIT.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A degree from MIT will get you a gas station job right now. So without any further ado, let me introduce Scott Guthrie. How are you, Scott?
Pretty good, Carl.
What an honor it is. What an honor it is, Scott, sir.
That's right, Scott. It goes without saying that I'm very excited that you're on the show today.
And for Mark to get excited is an incredible, thing.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah, we've been trying to put this together for a while now, so it is generally cause for excitement that we've got it going.
That's the reason why we went to the bar, right?
Yeah, that's right. We were depressed.
No, as it turned out, we've just been waiting for a good opportunity for schedules to meet, and this is it.
Well, sounds great.
Well, Scott, I got to tell you, I first met you at Dev Connections, and good conference, by the way, which you always do keynotes at. And you were this was last year in New Orleans?
Yes.
And you were showing Whidbey. This was before Alpha came out. This was before anybody had even heard of it. And you showed a ASP.NET demo, which we talked about on the show, actually, a couple of times, where you just took a table from the Server Explorer, dragged it onto a page, and there was a grid. Boom. And you set a couple of, like the sorting property, and it sorts, and you sort the edit property or whatever, the allow editing or enable editing or whatever property, and it turns into an editable grid that automatically updates with no code. And another thing you said that was that blew me away was that the goal of ASP.NET is to reduce the amount of code that people have to write by 75%. Are you guys on the mark for that number?
Yeah, that's sort of one of our big goals that we have for ASP.NET 2.0, which is codename Whidbey.
Right.
And it's basically kind of really focus on developer productivity, really look hard at what are the types of apps that people are building today with ASP.NET and with web development in general, and really try to figure out, okay, how can we make it easier? How can we make it faster in terms of building your app and deploying it and running it, and how can we just make life better for developers? And so that is one of our goals, is to try to cut down the number of lines of code you need to write, or more specifically, the amount of time it takes to get an app out in terms of writing code by about 70-75%, from going from ASP.NET v1.1 today to ASP.NET Whidbey, which is the 2.0 release. So it's a pretty ambitious goal.
Yeah, I would say so.
Every time I say it, no one believes me. So one of those fun goals that everyone kind of rolls their eyes and goes, "Oh yeah, sure."
And that's an average too, right? I mean, there are some features that you reduce the amount of code you have to write by 100% or 99.9%.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's kind of the collective sum, and we think we're fairly close. If usually if people give me an hour or two, building some apps and doing some demos, people leave pretty convinced that either we're already there or we're pretty darn close. So yeah, we're feeling pretty good about that.
Cool. Now this is a case where you're generating more code that the programmer doesn't have to write, but the code is accessible to them. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is avoid a situation where we kind of, from a tool perspective, try to hide productivity by just sort of what we call code spitting code into your face or behind the covers.
Right.
Because what we find is that ultimately that works okay for kind of demo purposes, but when you're in a real app and you kind of don't understand what's going on in terms of the code that's there, and the code might not be round tripped, and you make an update and then the tool clobbers it, that you end up running into problems there. So what we've tried to do is avoid generating code kind of on the fly, generating code into your project, and instead really focused on trying to come up with a set of features that kind of build in a stack layer, and I can describe that more.
Yeah.
And really try to sort of bake in core features into the product in a nice layered approach, so that you can go ahead and get down and dirty and actually tweak them and really customize them in a rich level. But at the same time, you don't actually have to have a tool that's generating thousands of lines of code for you.
Right.
And so when I say reducing
really
75% of the code, basically I mean the total amount of code in your project, both that you've written and the tool generates for you.
Wow. Fantastic. Are there other big goals or themes of ASP.NET Whidbey that, other than the reduction in code?
Yeah, well, so one of them is certainly a reduction in code. The other kind of big themes that we have focus, to some extent, less on developers and more on administrators, and kind of how can you go ahead and manage a single server or a farm of servers in a really easy way. So, for example, we've invested a lot of effort in V2 focusing on configuration management.
Yeah.
In V1 and V1.1, we had a sort of an XML-based config system that we still have in V2, and people like it because it's simple. They can understand where the config is stored. They understand, they can use any, text editor to go ahead and update it.
Mm-hmm.
What we've added in V2, though, is built on top of that model and introduced a rich config API. So that in addition to, using standard text editors or XML editors to update your config, you can also now, write a programmatic script to update things.
Are there enhancements to Server Explorer that make it easier for administrative?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so on top of that config API, we then have rich admin tools.
Cool.
And we have a variety coming out. And so, for example, inside your ISMMC snap-in now, you'll just see an ASP.NET tab. And within there, every single setting inside the config file can be administered using the kind of easy Windows-based admin tool. That'll do validation and all that stuff. And you update any setting, hit OK, and basically we'll save it out to the XML files on disk.
Now, does that work for any of the config files, or?
Correct. Yeah, that'll go ahead and work for every single section that we ship inside our either machine.config or web.config files.
Wow.
And we'll automatically know which config file to put them in. So if you're updating an application setting, we'll put it into the web.config file inside the application. Alternatively, you can, if you make a site-wide setting, it'll save it at the site level, or if you make a machine change, it'll make it at the machine level.
Wow, that's cool. When we were talking with Javal Lowy on the show a couple of shows ago, that was one thing that I wished. I told him I wished that I would see in the next version, and apparently that's true. Is just configurators, UI to work with the XML. If you're not careful, and you use the wrong case for a setting or something like that, you can mess things up. So that's a welcome addition.
Yeah, certainly for editing XML.
You'll also see in our development tools inside Visual Studio. So this is less the administrator focus and more the developer focus.
Right.
You're going to see IntelliSense when you're actually editing a web.config file.
Wow.
And so you will get statement completion as well as sort of validation of web.config files as well as XML files in general. So anything that has a schema or a DTD, you'll get IntelliSense and validation against.
Scott, since you brought up IntelliSense, I've got to ask you, if you're writing inline script, or basically inline ASP.NET, do you get IntelliSense now for the script or the language inside the HTML view?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the question is basically if you're writing, so in ASP.NET we have two models of development. One is called code behind, and the other one is called sort of single page or single file approach. And that's where you have server code inside the ASPX file itself. And that can be either inside the angle bracket percent block, or more commonly with ASP.NET, you have a script runner equals server block that you have your event handlers inside. And so the code's logically separate, but in the same physical file.
Right.
And with Visual Studio today, you don't get IntelliSense for the code inside those. With Whidbey, Visual Studio will support full IntelliSense against those, as well as debugging.
Awesome.
That is awesome.
And we obviously continue to fully support code behind. We've actually made a number of improvements to code behind to make it even cleaner and simpler and a little bit more object-oriented than it is today. And the nice thing is, as a developer, you basically get to choose, which of the two models that you want to use. We typically see a lot of professional developers and enterprise developers prefer the code behind model, but a lot of developers also prefer single file. And so the nice thing is you can choose whichever one you want.
Well, Mark, it sounds like that it's really true, the tenet that I've heard, that Microsoft tools tend to be really good at version 3.
Right.
And this, not that versions 1 and 2 weren't incredible, but, the focus was on core fundamental features, and now it sounds like you guys, Scott, are going the extra mile and saying, all right, how can we make the stuff easier to use? How can we make it easier for the programmer? How can we add the little nice things that we're known for?
Yeah, it's in many ways both in terms of the platform as well as the tool side, kind of a version 3 product, if you will. I mean, I guess it is technically a version 3.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, though, that version 3s tend to be awesome? Like, look at DOS 3.0, Visual Basic 3.0. They tend to be the real, when the rest of the world says, now I'm going to get it. Yeah,
version 3s tend to be big. One of the reasons for that, and this is true, I think, for .NET is, version 1 was a massive, big undertaking that took us sort of years and years to work on. And one of the things when you work on a product, especially a V1 product, where you don't have existing tests to leverage, you don't have kind of existing documentation to leverage, you don't have existing code base to leverage, you're just doing so much that, it takes an awfully long time to ship it. And, as you get towards the end, you suddenly realize, wow, to make it complete, we need just this extra one feature.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great after building some apps to have this feature and this feature? And
you have people going, no, ship it, no.
Well, yeah, the challenge you have is basically, your test team is saying, hey, we got to finish testing the entire product. The documentation team is saying we got to finish it. The dev team is saying, hey, we got a lot of bugs and perf tuning left to do. And so you end up having to say, okay, we're going to put that on the list for the next version or for a future version.
Right.
And so when we shipped V1, we had this sort of massive list of things that we wanted to do. When your next release comes out after a big V1 release, it tends to be a smaller release, kind of a point release.
Like a fixes kind of thing.
Yeah, you address kind of, top customer issues. And frankly, customers often want to see a point release that's after. That's where it's no longer a V1 release. It's a much safer release.
Right.
In terms of just, presence of mind and stuff. And so to some extent, the release that we came out with in 2003, which is codename Everett or, V11, to some extent was that type of release. It's a really great release, but it's more it's more of a fit and finish release where we added a few more things that we wanted to add in there. Made it work better with Windows Server 2003, which just came out, and did a lot of important things, but not some of the big major things that we postponed from V1 that we wanted to address.
Yeah,
that's really what Whidbey's about. Is it's basically, we cracked open a spreadsheet that had a couple hundred major features, and we said, hey, let's just go to town. And one of the things that we're working on doing for when probably later in October is we're going to release kind of a white paper. I'm calling kind of the 101 cool things coming in Whidbey, and the goal is have like a paragraph for each with maybe a screenshot, and have each of the 101 things make you go, wow, that's cool. Oh man, I want that. And then you just keep going down the list, and hopefully by the end you're just kind of in nirvana.
Well, as a preview to nirvana, why don't you lay a few of those on us now? I mean, within the law, of course.
Sure. Let's see, a couple fun ones that people might find interesting. Let's say data access is one that you talked about a little bit earlier about.
Unbelievable.
About kind of how can we reduce the lines of code you need to write in terms of data access, and more specifically, how can you make Web UI, which is inherently a stateless operation, meaning you're going back and forth between a client and a server. How can you make that kind of stateless model work well for data access? And today with V1 and ASP.NET, we do have a clean data model in the sense that you can take any data source and data binding against a data control, and the data control will go ahead and render the content as HTML. It's much cleaner than classic ASP. It's much cleaner than, say, PHP or JSP.
Yeah.
But the downside is you have to still write the 2 lines of code, to set the data source and data bind it. And what's even worse, though, is you have to know where and when to actually write those 2 lines of code.
Right.
Is it inside your page load event handler? Well, it probably is, but you probably need to put it inside a if page not is post back.
Right.
Block in order to make sure you don't do it on a post back. And if you're doing a sort filter, when do you do the sort filter, and when do you rebind the list? And
those are the kinds of things that people go to training classes for to figure out, and it drives them nuts.
Yep. And once your page gets more and more complex, figuring out where all those edge cases, when do I need to do it, and how do I do it, etc. It just ends up being frankly pretty hard. And,
complex.
You end up going to a site, finding a sample, and copying and pasting it. Probably to get started in a lot of situations. It ends up being challenging when you want to have a really rich, data manipulation UI. And what we've done in V2 is made that kind of dramatically easier, so that you can do, as you're saying, we can drag and drop a grid onto a page and bind it to a data source, and do sorting and paging and editing and updating and deleting, basically with no lines of code.
How about other controls? New controls that you're introducing?
Well, we're introducing about, right now in the alpha, we have about 40 new controls.
Jeez.
Server controls alone.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of new controls. Some of them, as I was mentioning, in the data space, specifically to enable data, binding and data manipulation, not just with kind of a 2-tier data model, but also we're investing a lot in terms of making sure that we have a really great story for doing like 3-tier data model.
Right.
Manipulation, and so you'll see, data-specific controls to help enable that. You'll see, rich tree view controls. You'll see some really rich personalization controls that'll let you sort of customize your site as an end user in a rich way.
Neat.
You'll see security controls that'll help you manage, login authentication and role management on your site.
Oh, that's great.
In terms of UI. You're going to see a lot of new controls, and the nice thing is all the controls are kind of, or not all of them, but most of them are built on top of what we kind of call building block services or application services. So, for example, when we do have a control, like a security control that handles maybe, say, login authentication to your site, so you can just drop ASP:/login onto your site,
right,
and you have a login system enabled. It's not encapsulated within the control itself. Instead, we actually have some rich membership and role management APIs underneath that, and that's what the login control is calling into. So if you're a developer who likes to write a lot, who enjoys writing code, and more specifically who wants to get their fingers dirty in the overall system, the nice thing is that the controls are all kind of a nice abstraction on top of a lower level API that you can take advantage of as well.
Now, I know Mark has got another question for you, but a quick one here. third-party controls. The third-party controls that are coming out for Whidbey, and I imagine that you guys have a great program for vendors. Are those going to be built on the intrinsic controls that are there in Whidbey in V2, or do you see a lot of third-party developers just starting from the control class and going up from there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're going to see control developers do a mixture of both. There'll be people that will start, with the bare bones control classes and build rich controls on top of that, and then there'll be people that will go ahead and do what we call composite controls.
Right.
Where basically what you're doing is you're building a control which in turn uses other controls. For example, like the ones that we ship in the box.
Right.
And I think the nice thing about our control model is that it enables kind of this kind of compositing nature, meaning you can have control built from other controls, which in turn is being used from another control. And so that is one of the kind of the most powerful parts of our overall control model. And so I expect a lot of people to start off with the controls that we ship, and then they'll just make them even richer.
Well, Scott, speaking of controls, we're going to take a break for a word from our sponsor here, and Mark's got some other questions, so hang tight, okay?
Okay.
Hey, if you're going to be doing any serious ASP.NET development, you're going to have to check out Spread for Web Forms from Farpoint Technologies. This is a grid spreadsheet for ASP.NET development that's got incredible high-level features. You can have multiple sheets, styles, paging, cell spanning, multi-line headers, sorting, a rich set of cell types, an incredible spread designer. It's all coded from the ground up in C#. And it's affordable, too. It only starts at $5.99. And, Farpoint Technologies, they've been around since the good old days. This control is currently the featured control at www.asp.net. So there's an incredible review there. You can also check out more details online. And by the way, if you're going to be doing any .NET Windows Forms development, you also might want to check out Spread for Windows Forms. Incredible stuff. Now let's get back to our show with Scott Guthrie of Microsoft talking about ASP.NET 2.0 and Whidbey right here on .NET Rocks. Don't you go away. And we're back. So, Mark, I know you got a question. You're chomping at the bit. I can hear you through the phone.
Oh, a bunch of them. When you mentioned personalization earlier, Scott, I thought about Commerce Server. Are there any enhancements that allow ASP.NET to work well with Commerce Server or better?
Yeah, we're working very closely with the Commerce Server team as well as specifically the SharePoint team and the Content Management Server team, which are 3 products today that are built on top of ASP.NET v1.1. And so there's definitely, their next releases will all target Whidbey. And so you're going to see a lot of rich integration then where they're going to take advantage of ASP.NET in a really rich way. One of the things that we've done, I mentioned earlier about how we have kind of these sort of building block APIs or building block services that we think apps are built on top of, and to give you some examples of them, like a membership service for authentication, a role management service for role management, and a personalization system to manage sort of personalization.
And this is all in the box?
These are all in the box.
Oh, my God.
But one of the things that we've done, which is kind of, I think, really cool in V2 and really kind of, I think, resonates really well with especially advanced developers, is that all of the core building blocks APIs that we have and services that we provide are built on top of what we call provider model. And the way the provider model works is it's a configuration option where you can swap out our underlying data store or underlying functionality within that service and replace it with your own. And so, for example, if you don't like where we store usernames and passwords with our out-of-the-box membership system, which will store it in a database, or you don't like our schema that we put inside the database, you can basically subclass our provider, change the schema or change the location of the credentials to be wherever you want, and then basically you can just register your provider inside the web.config file, or alternatively the machine.config file.
Nice.
And so, and from that point on, anything that uses that membership API will delegate to your provider, and you can basically intercept and do whatever you want there. And the nice thing is all of our controls that are built on top of those APIs, in turn then will call into your provider. And so one of the things that we're doing is working very closely with, Commerce Server, like you mentioned, CMS and SharePoint, to basically enable them to go ahead and intercept and plug into these APIs. And what that means is that they're able to do much, much richer integration into ASP.NET than they were able to before. And so when I install Commerce Server, rather than use the ASP.NET credential system, I could, for example, use the Commerce Server credential system instead. Right. Likewise, for personalization, I could use the SharePoint personalization system instead of the out-of-the-box one, or I could write my own personalization system and plug it in as well. If that gives kind of advanced solutions sort of a really rich opportunity to customize and extend the system in ways that you couldn't before.
Fantastic.
Also back to controls again, the data grid is certainly a very popular control. Mm-hmm. A lot of websites exist out there like Marcy Robillard's Data Grid Girls that target just what you can do with it. Can you tell us anything about enhancements to the data grid in Whidbey?
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest enhancements that we're making to kind of our grid controls, or specifically with regard to kind of enabling more out-of-the-box scenarios to just work with the grid control. So things like sorting and paging, things like editing, things like deleting. Today the grid provides UI to handle those scenarios, but to really, to handle the sort, you need to handle an event on the grid, talk to the data source directly, get the data, and then apply it to the
data
grid.
view or something.
Yeah, and so you have to write, some additional code to sort of manage that relationship. And so the control's being enhanced significantly so that basically out of the box, that'll just work.
Right.
And so you can just set a property which is enable sorting, and internally it'll go ahead and provide the sorting mechanisms in order to do that.
Are there enhancements to things like setting up template columns?
Template editing is getting a lot richer.
Oh, thank you. I got to tell you, I really did dislike the template editing UI.
Yeah, the template editing UI is got a pretty major update to it. A couple other kind of neat tricks that are being added to template editing is the ability to do two-way data binding. So, for example, today, if you build a template inside a data grid column and you put it in a text box, you can do binding so that you can actually populate the text box with a value inside the data grid. That's fairly easy to do, and you can do that declaratively. If you want to enable an update scenario, though, you end up having to I forget the exact event, but it's basically like the column update or row update event.
Right.
And you have to basically pull the value out of the text box and set it on a property, and write the explicit code to do that.
Yeah.
And the nice thing now is we have this sort of declarative way that you can basically say to a control, this is the property I'm binding against its parent container. And it's two-directional. And so when the container says I want to do an update, we can actually automatically pull the value out of that property and push it to the container.
You've had only one-directional binding in ASP.
This is basically two-directional binding now.
And that's more of what people expect out of binding anyway, I think.
Yeah, and it specifically for doing kind of templated column editing, it makes it much richer.
So is it easier then to set up drop-down combo boxes and things like that in the grid?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Other things that we're doing specifically with template editing, you're going to see much richer design time UI for when you want to do binding against a parent. Today you kind of have to fish around in kind of the property grid to figure out exactly how you go ahead and set up a binding relationship. We'll kind of have helper UI that'll kind of guide you towards that. And then ultimately, the other thing that we're kind of doing is if you build a custom column type, which a lot of control developers have done and post them on the web, the tool will actually recognize those types when they're installed on the property or on the toolbox, and so we'll automatically enable those things as options that you can add as convert your column into within the design surface as well, which enables a lot of rich scenarios where someone could build, for example, a drop-down list column or
right.
Whatever custom column they want. they can just add it to their project, and from that point on, they can use it with the standard data grid, and away you go.
Right. Are there any issues with migrating current ASP.NET projects over to Whidbey?
Well, our goal with Whidbey is 100% backwards compatibility, which means specifically you can take an existing app that's running and you can copy it onto a server, and it should just work. No code changes required, no recompilations even required inside the tool. Everything should just work. ASP.NET 2.0 is also now 64-bit enabled, which means that you can actually copy your existing app, which is running on, say, an Intel 32-bit system, and you can actually copy it onto a 64-bit machine, and it will just work. But specifically, it'll work inside a 64-bit address space, so you can now take advantage of, oodles and oodles of memory.
And I take it that updating, loading an old project from Visual Studio 2003 into Whidbey will automatically do the conversions necessary.
Correct. Yeah. When you go to update a project, all your source code will continue to work. And what Whidbey will go ahead and do, Visual Studio Whidbey will go ahead and do, is if you have an existing Everett project or existing Visual Studio 2002 or 2003 project, it'll basically upgrade it and migrate it to Whidbey. And so upgrade the project system, and
that's
you'll
good.
be able to just hit F5 and away you go.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And explicitly no code changes required.
I want to ask you a little bit about Microsoft Windows 2003 and IIS 6.0 as it relates to this new version of ASP.NET. How closely related are they, and what are the sort of the benefits that an ASP.NET 2.0 application can get from Windows Server 2003 that they couldn't from Windows 2000?
Sure. Well, so one important thing to call out is that ASP.NET Whidbey will run on any of the existing IIS versions that ASP.NET supports today.
Okay, good.
So it'll run on IIS 6 and Windows Server 2003. It'll also run on IIS 5 with Windows 2000, and it will also run on IIS 5.1, which ships as part of Windows XP Pro.
Okay.
So you don't need to upgrade your operating system. You don't need to upgrade your web server in order to use ASP.NET 2.0. Your existing investments just work fine. Now, the other thing, though, is that if you do have an IIS 6 server running on Windows Server 2003, there are a number of features that we can take advantage of that provide you kind of additional benefits. And so some of the specific ones I can think of, one of them includes sort of scenarios where I have, let's say, a site and I want to use the ASP.NET security system.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a mixture of classic ASP pages as well as ASP.NET pages, as well as HTML pages and JPEGs, etc. Today with ASP.NET, there isn't a way that you can use the Forms Authentication System to securely block access to classic ASP pages. Certainly if you use Windows Authentication, you can do it across both. But if I'm using sort of an HTML-based Forms Authentication model, where I'm authenticating against a database, etc., I can't, for example, deny or allow access based on roles to classic ASP pages.
Mm-hmm.
With ASP.NET 2.0 and IIS 6, you can. And so you can even do it for non-ASP things, so things like Java server pages or PHP as well. You can basically just go ahead, either using the admin tool, or you can just use the web.config file and say, directly and explicitly just say, deny access to this classic ASP resource unless you're in this role, and the ASP.NET security system will just kick in and away you go. So integrating with existing content, becomes much richer. Right. Other things that you can take advantage of include performance. We'll get much better performance on IIS 6. 64-bit is something that's fully enabled on Windows Server 2003.
Mark Anders talked a little bit about the performance benefits of Server 2003. That was a long time ago, though. That was almost a year ago, wasn't it, Mark? What is the real deal with technically speaking, with Server 2003 and the reason why it's so much higher performant?
Yeah, for Windows Server 2003, there's kind of two major reasons why it performs better. One is just there's been a lot of core OS tuning, which just makes overall operations faster. So, for example, if you look at like file system performance or file sharing performance, things non-web related, you'll see Windows Server 2003 is just a lot faster there.
Okay.
For web-specific stuff, then, the thing that really makes Windows Server 2003 faster is IIS 6 and the new architecture model that IIS 6 has. So specifically, if you have IS5 or kind of an existing IIS web server, the way it works is there is a web server running in user mode, which is kind of the standard, address space that applications that you and I write that run on top of an operating system run inside of. And it then in turn talks to the network driver in the kernel, which is listening on, say, port 80 to accept HTTP requests. And when a request comes in, it comes into the kernel, it then goes up into user mode, and then in user mode, that INET info process that's talking to the kernel, then in turn with ASP.NET calls out to the ASP.NET_WP.exe worker process, which is where your code's actually running.
Right.
And that's specifically separate from the web server, so that if there's a crash or a memory leak or some issues runs into with the application, it doesn't bring down the overall web server.
Okay.
The downside, though, is that you're basically doing a process hop.
Yeah, that's
an additional
expensive.
process hop on each request, and so that takes some resources up. Now, the good news is that we've kind of optimized it such that the process hops actually, even with a simple page, ends up being faster than classic ASP when it's running inside IS5 in proc. So it's not a huge performance hit, but there is opportunities to make it faster. And what we did with IS6 is IS6 actually, rather than have the core HTTP listener running in user mode inside INET info, there's instead a network driver called HTTP sys or HTTP.sys that runs in kernel mode. And so when a HTTP request comes in now, basically it will then directly go from kernel mode into the worker process that's hosting ASP.NET to process the request. And so there's one less process hop. And so when you're transferring a lot of content or a large HTML page or a JPEG or something like that, it's just a lot more efficient on the system because you're not copying a large file twice.
Yeah, I was going to say that results in being able to handle a bigger load per box, even without CPU increases and all that. In memory usage.
The other nice thing, it helps in terms of memory usage. The other thing it helps is that we're able to the HTTP sys driver that runs in the kernel mode also has a built-in cache mechanism. So when you can actually say, I want to output cache this thing that I'm actually writing, and rather than store it in user mode, I want to basically store the cache copy, just the output, right next to the network driver in the kernel. And so for things like static JPEGs and HTML pages, that just makes things dramatically faster. And if you're using ASP.NET output caching on Windows Server 2003, ASP.NET will, if it detects that it can be cached in the kernel, will automatically push it down to that kernel level cache.
Sweet.
And that can lead to sort of just dramatic performance wins.
Wow.
In some of our tests, what we find typically is that we can't actually max out a Windows Server 2003 server when you have output caching. It's actually not the physical server that ends up being the bottleneck. It ends up being the network. And so, we can basically have 2 or 3 gigabit switches connected to the machine, and still it's the network that's the limiting factor, not the CPU on the server.
One more question, then I'll hand it over to Mark. What have you done in terms of bandwidth throttling and process throttling and things like that? Any new improvements there?
So Windows or IS6 does do as part of Windows Server 2003. So this is available today.
Right.
Does actually build in better support for monitoring the CPU utilization and the network utilization of the server. And so specifically you can set, as well as the memory utilization. And so you can actually set it on a per application pool basis, which is sort of a unique process per application. You can basically say if the memory goes above a certain level, either write to an event so that an administrator can say, oh, there's something going, I need to bill this customer more because they're using more resources. Or you can also just set it so it'll automatically terminate the process and restart it. So it's a little bit better in terms of throttling from that perspective.
Interesting.
Things that we're doing in ASP.NET 2.0 to make kind of overall monitoring and overall monitoring better is specifically adding kind of rich eventing support so that we can automatically notify an administrator when we think an application is doing something wrong. And that's no longer just sort of limited to memory usage. We can automatically send an email, for example, to an administrator anytime an unhandled exception occurs within an ASP.NET app.
Wow.
And we can say, here's the exception that occurred. here is the request in the browser that caused the exception to occur. And here's basically the stack trace of what it looks like.
Here's the cookie that has his name and email address.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, and basically then we can go ahead and email the administrator,
right,
as well as write it to an event log and things like that. So kind of when I was talking about making administration and management better with ASP.NET 2.0, that also kind of falls in that bucket of, how can we just kind of have self-healing and self-notifying applications that will basically go ahead and integrate with existing kind of IT operations staff.
Here's the list of MP3 files on the client's machine.
Yeah. We don't quite do that, but along those lines, yeah.
Well, Scott, I've got a burning question for you.
Sure.
If I've got an existing classic ASP application and I want to kind of build a blended ASP.NET classic ASP app, so I'm not having to rewrite everything, are there any enhancements or solutions that would allow me to share session between the two?
Great question.
There's a couple things that you can do. One is you can actually convert everything to ASP.NET. So I'll talk about the blending in just a second. One of the things that we're actually just about to release in the next couple of weeks, we're kind of in beta testing right now, is an ASP to ASP.NET converter. And so it's actually a tool that you can run on your classic ASP pages, and it will go through and actually automatically convert them to be ASP.NET enabled. In which case, everything in theory just works.
You're saying this is like a big upgrade wizard?
Yes, it's kind of like a big upgrade wizard, and it will be available for free off of the www.asp.net website.
That's awesome. I want to talk to you some more about that, but right now we're just going to take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor. Well, I remember the first time I saw ants. I was about 3 years old in the backyard, and I watched them crawling around, burn them with a magnifying glass. No, I'm not talking about ants. I'm talking about ants, the advanced .NET tool suite from Redgate Software. The first time I saw that was about a year ago. Ants is a profiler for ASP.NET or any web sites that you can use in lieu of the testing utility, the default testing utility that comes with Visual Studio. And you can set up scripts, and not only set up scripts on a single machine, but multiple machines to completely hammer your website and put it under stress and see how it performs. You can monitor the stress levels of your website with performance counters. And guess what? It's all written in .NET. It's all managed code. Not only that, but it's got a script engine built in that will generate VB.NET code inside the product. And this is just very, very cool. I can't tell you how cool this product is. So check it out at www.red-gate.com. It's affordable, and like I say, it's a .NET product. These guys are doing wonderful stuff over there in the UK. Check them out, Redgate Software. Now let's get back to our show, where Scott Guthrie is going to give us some secrets for merging ASP and ASP.NET sites together. Right here on .NET Rocks. Hey, don't you go away, huh? Okay, we're back, and we're talking with Scott Guthrie about ASP.NET 2.0 and Whidbey. Mark, you were talking about a hybrid ASP.NET ASP system with Scott.
Right, and Scott, I think you were just about to tell us what that enhancement was.
Yeah, it's basically we're still investigating whether we can share session state across classic ASP and ASP.NET automatically. There's a good chance that won't make it into Whidbey, although it might. There's a chance it might, if not, probably in the next release. There are, though, a number of existing third-party applications or components that you can use that basically provide a mechanism by which you can use like a session object that's shared across both systems. And I think if you go to the control gallery on the www.asp.net website, you can actually find a couple of examples from those that you can download.
Yeah, that's right. I've looked at those before.
But it is something we are also looking at, figuring out how we can maybe make it better directly in the box. The biggest issue historically has been that it requires some substantial changes to classic ASP.
Yeah, I was going to say, you may have a problem with backward compatibility there if you go messing with it.
That's why in the past that we shied away from it, is because we specifically want to, one of the messages we had when ASP.NET first came out was, we didn't touch classic ASP at all, so you don't have to worry about any compatibility issues with upgrading. And with our separate process model that we had in ASP.NET V1, when running on non-Windows 2003 systems, it would have required some huge changes to classic ASP to make that work. With IS6 and the new worker process model, because we actually now run in the same worker process as classic ASP, there's a good chance that we're going to be able to do some more stuff without making significant changes to classic ASP in order to enable that. So I think keep an eye out for the next release of IS. There's some stuff that we might be doing then.
That's great.
Any enhancements to working with component services or COM+? You mentioned doing 3-tier development earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in terms of in the Whidbey time frame, there are a number of things, or a few things that are coming out in the COM+ enterprise services arena. One of which I think is called can't remember the exact name of it actually, but it's basically the mechanism by which you can start and stop a transaction at any fixed point. And so you can basically say, I'm going to run this block of code and I want to start a distributed transaction and I want to end it here.
A save point?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily a save point in the sense that you can then later roll back. It's more a case of being able to launch and stop a distributed transaction without having to do it at an object boundary, which is what you need to do today with COM+. And so you can go ahead and have a single method, and you could sort of say, I'm going to actually have multiple transactions going on as part of this method without having to break it up into 3 separate components with a separate kind of transaction configured for each. So that I think is going to be a pretty sweet feature that people will take advantage of. In terms of overall making 3-tier development easier in terms of Whidbey, you're also going to see kind of a data access layer kind of designer show up in our tools. So you're going to be able to go ahead and very quickly and sort of from a nice kind of design model perspective, kind of add tables and add stored procedures onto a design surface, and then have those be represented as components that you can then access through code. And so you could say, I'm going to add the products table onto my data access layer. I'm going to add a couple custom methods to it that are going to configure different queries based on that. And then from code, I can just go ahead and access those in a strongly typed way, call into that data access layer and get my data back.
Cool. Is that an evolution of the data access blueprint?
I think it's incorporating some elements of that. There's also then object spaces, which is a new feature that's coming out, which is more sort of an object relational mapping tool. That's an alternative way you can also build your data access layer. I think that also incorporates some of the best practices.
Hey Scott, it sounds like you're doing some new things with data access that go to sort of the fundamentals of using SQL Server in Visual Studio 2003. Is ASP.NET 2.0 Whidbey and Yukon, are they sort of wrapped together? What's the relationship between those things?
Yeah, so as Carl alluded to, in the Whidbey timeframe, we're doing a lot of stuff with data access in SQL Server as well. So specifically, one of the things that we're doing is adding the support for you to write managed code directly inside your database server. So today, for example, if I wanted to write some ADO.NET code inside my ASP.NET app, or in a component being called from my ASP.NET app, that then calls to the database, and then calls a stored procedure within that database, I have to write that stored procedure in T-SQL, which is a sort of generic SQL kind of scripting-like language, if you will, in terms of doing data access. And for some things, T-SQL is very, very good. For other things, though, if I'm doing kind of complex joins, or if I'm trying to do some conditional logic as to what I return based on the output in the database, T-SQL tends to be a fairly difficult language to express those things in. Specifically like procedural logic, like an if statement or an else statement or a case statement. I end up having to kind of use SQL calculus and conditional logic in order to actually to handle that. And the nice thing with Whidbey is I can now actually write my stored procedure using VB or C#. And so I could just have an if statement and branch based on that kind of mechanism.
Now that's going to also require an update to SQL Server, right? The Yukon.
Correct. That's in the next version of SQL codename Yukon. And so that comes out in the same time frame as Whidbey.
Okay, that's what I'm getting at.
And our Visual Studio tools will have great support for basically, building stored procedures, even doing richer things like user-defined types. So, for example, if I want to build a custom column type, let's call it, the point class or some type of custom data type that I want to store in my SQL database. Today, building a user-defined type in SQL is definitely doable, but from a coding perspective can be a little challenging.
Right.
The nice thing is I can actually just build any standard value class using a .NET code and basically then use that value class as my user-defined type. And so just say, for example, if I'm using C#, I could just say I'm going to declare a struct. Here's the name of the struct. Here are the 5 fields in it. And now I can actually use that to basically store data inside my database, which is a pretty cool feature.
Very cool. This is probably a good time to disclaim the the use of managed code languages for everything in Yukon. And this is a concern that some of our prior guests have had, and we've had as well, is that I can see Attila, the database administrator, going through the roof when they see lots and lots of code that they don't understand in the stored procedures in their databases. So what advice would you give to the listener in terms of how do I know, when I should use T-SQL and when I should use VB or C#?
Yeah, so it's I'm probably not the best person to ask that because I'm not a...
Okay.
I know enough about data. I know more about data access than most people, but I wouldn't claim to be a SQL Server expert. I'd probably defer that to someone from the SQL team. But one of the important things in terms of the message that we are communicating is that you can absolutely write an app that has both. So, for example, you could say, these 20 stored procedures, which are fairly basic and simple, I'm just going to express them in T-SQL because they're only 7 or 8 lines of code.
Okay.
This one particular stored procedure, which is 1,000 lines of T-SQL, and it's really, really complicated, and it's doing an awful lot of very advanced computation. This, I'm going to actually go ahead and write this using managed code.
Cool.
And you can make those trade-offs where you can decide, this thing is going to be in T-SQL, this thing isn't. And the nice thing is the programming model for how you call those stored procedures is identical. So from the external perspective, you just think you're calling a stored procedure. You don't think you're necessarily calling, a managed method or anything like that. And so as a developer and specifically as an administrator, you have ultimately an awful lot of flexibility in terms of choosing what you want to express using whatever language you want. And so I think ultimately it's going to come down to particular IT shops and particular DBAs, choosing kind of what do they feel most comfortable with, and more specifically for the particular problem at hand, what makes the most sense.
Scott, you mentioned caching before. What's new in terms of output caching and the cache object?
Yeah, so that's one of the areas that we've invested a lot in terms of kind of trying to take our output caching and just our overall cache engine forward. So V1 today has a really rich kind of cache API and output cache system, so that you can go ahead and actually say, I'm getting back a data set from a database. I want to store this thing on the middle tier for a certain amount of time and reuse it, as opposed to always going back to the database. Or likewise, with output caching, I can go ahead and explicitly say, this particular, say, product catalog page, I'm going to go ahead and save the result or output cache the result of this page for, let's say, 10 minutes. And as long as the same inputs come in, ASP.NET, rather than re-execute the page and go against the database, we'll just go ahead and immediately transmit the results back out. So it's a really powerful feature that exists today. The one downside with it is that the way you specify kind of how long you want to cache something or how, the cache and validation policy of the thing is always timer-based.
Right.
In other words, you say, I want to output cache this page for, a minute at a time or 30 seconds at a time or 45 seconds. And that's good in the sense that you can, control the lifetime of the page. It's bad if the page is based on data that's dynamic.
Right.
So in other words, if I'm going against a database, what I really want to say is don't cache this thing for, 45 seconds. I want to say cache this thing as long as the data is accurate. And once the data changes, automatically invalidate the cache thing and regenerate it on the next request.
That's a feature that we've been wanting to have for a long time. We were talking about that on a prior show, whereas what a lot of people do is change a file or write out to a file. Isn't that what you were doing, Mark?
Yeah, actually, what we were talking about was using the cache object. So we're caching a data set, and what I really want to be able to do is if a user makes a change to the data in the database, I want it to somehow notify ASP.NET to reload that data set into the cache object.
Right.
So a way that I was doing that before, I could set it up so that it would respond to a file being changed, and basically was doing it with a trigger through SQL Server.
Right.
So what I would want to do is avoid doing, having to go through a trigger. That was kind of kludgy for me to do it that way.
Yeah, you can kind of kludge it together a little bit using the file dependency support in the Cache API today, and have a trigger that writes to a file or sends a message.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing.
There's a couple downsides to that. One, besides the fact that you have to write a lot of code and kind of kludge that together. The other big issue is that with a trigger that's sending a notification or writing to a file, you end up blocking synchronously the transaction that's completing.
Right.
And so the database will end up being slower as a result. If you're not careful, and frankly, it ends up being pretty hard to avoid that. What we're adding in V2 of ASP.NET, though, is built-in support between ASP.NET and SQL so that we can actually do that kind of invalidation scheme for you and do it very, very efficiently.
Sweet.
And so basically you can now on a page, in addition to saying, yeah, output cache this thing for up to 10 hours, you can also say, oh, and by the way, make a dependency on this particular database or this particular table in a database. And the nice thing is with the next version of SQL Server, which is Yukon, you can even set it such that we'll automatically watch all the ADO.NET connections that you make and all the queries that you make as part of that. And so we do that inside the ADO.NET subsystem.
Scott, are we really talking about the same thing? When I was talking about the cache object, I was referring to the object that's kind of like the app object on steroids versus output caching, which I think of as something different, being controlled by setting attributes up in the ASP.NET file itself.
Yeah, it's actually the same thing. The cache API is kind of the Uber thing, which is the programmatic thing that you can control. And you can put any object you want inside that. The way output caching works is it's basically, you can either control it through the response.cache API, or you can also use kind of the declarative output cache directive at the top of the page. And all that does is it basically just saves the output of the page and puts it in the cache. So ultimately, yeah, it's the same thing.
Cool.
Right.
And what we've added
I never realized they were the same.
Yeah, it's ultimately they're writing to the same cache. And the way the cache works is it'll automatically monitor the memory usage on the system. And so in addition to controlling policy lifetime, so in other words, if you say I want to cache this thing for 10 seconds, we'll manage that, but we'll also watch the memory usage on the box. And so if the memory usage starts going up, we'll actually go through the cache and find out what hasn't been accessed recently and start automatically evicting and flushing those items from the cache.
Hey, Scott, this all sounds just absolutely incredible. If you combine this with what we heard from Amanda and Paul Vick about the VB language in Whidbey, it just makes for an absolutely stunning package. And I think what's on everybody's minds is this going to be an open beta? And, when can we expect to see, when are we going to start talking about Whidbey in terms of, what we can download and get our hands on?
Well, yeah, so Whidbey hopefully will be pretty stunning. There's a lot of stuff that I think I've alluded to about 2% of the overall feature set in ASP.NET in this kind of hour.
Oh, man.
There's an awful lot of good stuff that I haven't mentioned. So, yeah, it is going to be a pretty big release. In terms of when we'll start talking about it publicly, that'll basically begin later this month in October. We have two conferences coming up. There's the ASP.NET Connections Conference in Palm Springs, as well as the PDC conference in Los Angeles. And at both of those conferences, we're going to start talking about and demoing publicly ASP.NET V2 for the first time. Attendees at the PDC will actually walk away with the ASP.NET 2.0 bits.
Wow.
So that's not too far off.
Now that's the ASP.NET 2.0 bits. What about the rest of Visual Studio?
That includes Visual Studio. That'll include all the new VB languages. It'll include Yukon. And the PDC will also be handing out sneak peek, very early edition of Longhorn, which is the next release of Windows that includes Whidbey as part of it. There will also be a book coming out in October specifically about Whidbey. It's called, I think, a preview of ASP.NET 2.0, coming out from Madison Wesley. And you'll be able to get that as well. And it's similar to the preview book that came out at the PDC 2000, which first talked about what was called ASP Plus back then, but became ASP.NET V1.
Yeah, so it'll basically be a public beta in October?
It won't be a public beta in October.
It will or won't?
It will not.
Okay.
It will be an alpha release, and it will be a somewhat restricted alpha release.
I see.
The public beta will probably start in the spring. And at that point, then anyone can download it. And at that point, it will also be feature complete. You know, an important thing to keep in mind if you do see the Whidbey bits this fall is that it's only about 2/3 of the way done in terms of features. So there's an awful lot of features that are coming still, especially in the tool. And so, you know, if you're missing a feature, if you're going, gosh, you know, why haven't they finished implementing this? It's because we're not quite done yet. There's still a lot more coming. But once it is feature complete in the spring, we'll then go to a widespread beta.
Well, we're just about out of time. Mark, do you have any other last-minute questions to ask?
No, just a comment. I'm going to be dreaming about the stuff that you've talked about today, Scott.
Oh, good. It's pretty fun. Like I think, you know, I think once everything is finished, and you know, as I mentioned, stuff even that we're showing in the alpha time frame in the PDC and even later this month at ASP.NET Connections that so far kind of blows people away. Once you see the beta bits, you know, the beta bits put this stuff to shame. So there's an awful lot more coming in the beta time frame, and the experience in the full beta is kind of, we hope, be truly kind of mind blowing. But yeah, it's a pretty fun release, and the key thing when I talk about at the beginning, like the 70% code reduction, which you know you might or might not believe as part of this interview, but when you get play with it, you might start to believe it. It's the goal at the end of the day isn't actually just that, hey, you know, life becomes so much simpler that we stop developing.
Right.
It's more that you can actually take that reduction and take all the features that are now in the box, and by not having to spend all your time doing a lot of grunt code and figure out kind of low-level wire-up stuff that you know just to get common stuff working, you can actually step back and you can make your app dramatically better because you can take advantage of rich features like personalization. That we'll include in the box, like role management, like some of the richer data, object model, object binding type of features. And you can actually build just a dramatically richer experience for an end user that's visiting the app. And as a result, you can actually take that time that you otherwise would have spent just trying to get simple stuff working, and you can really make your apps rock.
Well, that's great, man.
And at the end of the day, just build dramatically better solutions.
Well, this has been one of my favorite shows. You know, it's just like Christmas time. Like I told Amanda and Paul, I feel like Mark. I'm going to be dreaming myself. And I guess I'll see you at Dev Connections, and we'll also be gearing up to do some Whidbey classes here at Franklin's Net in the spring. I guess I'll see you there.
Sounds great. In the meantime, what I'd recommend to people that aren't going to be either at the ASP.NET Connections conference or the PDC this October, the things to watch out for is to visit the www.asp.net website fairly frequently. And we will be posting a section on the site dedicated to Whidbey later this month.
Great.
And it will specifically have kind of 101 cool things coming out and go into some detail there that you can actually read and hopefully salivate over, as well as a link to the book about V2 that you can go ahead and download even if you don't have the bits, or you can go ahead and buy even if you don't have the bits, and as well as some samples that you can take a look at as well.
Great.
And that'll give a good early taste of what V2 looks like. And then the key thing, just to reiterate, is the fact that all your existing code will work just fine on V2. So, you know, while V2 is on the horizon and looking great, you know, keep writing ASP.NET V1.1.
Yeah.
And
it's important.
And it'll get even better in V2.
Scott, on behalf of myself, Mark, the listening public, the teeming millions out there, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us all about Whidbey.
Great stuff. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Absolutely, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
Talk to you later.